Narcissistic Countertransference in Modern Psychoanalysis by Hyman Spotnitz, 1979. Part 1. Psychoanalytic literature of the last quarter century reflects two evolutionary developments in the operational concept of countertransference. One is the tempering of the wholly negative attitude it originally evoked, which was so succinctly expressed by Flies, undesirable and a hindrance. Ideally, therefore, countertransference should not occur. But it does. Always resistance must always be analyzed. Without disputing the ubiquity of countertransference or dismissing its resistance potential, the theoretical formulations of all psychoanalytic schools currently accord some measure of respect to the phenomenon. In this process of detoxification, outright prescription has given way to thoughtful assessment and specific recommendations for the constructive use of countertransference. A parallel development, more implicitly suggested in the literature since mid-century, has been the gradual dissolution of the initially monolithic concepts of transference and countertransference. The simultaneity of the so-called widening scope of indications for psychoanalysis and reports of essentially different transference states observed in patients with the more severe emotional disorders was more than coincidental. The existence of narcissistic transference and its implications for the treatment of schizophrenic and non-psychotic patients were comprehensively explored. Formulations on a continuum of transference states, ranging from the familiar Oedipal-type transference to psychotic transference, were followed by impressions of characteristic emotional reactions to each state. Thus, Kernberg postulated a continuum of countertransference reactions ranging from that related to the symptomatic neuroses on one extreme to psychotic reactions at the other. This ongoing refining process enhances understanding of the interpersonal dynamics of the analytic relationship, especially in cases that encompass the evolution of primitive transference states into object, Oedipal type, transference, which permits the therapist to exert a decisive influence on the patient. In addition to their general diagnostic values and clinical implications, these distinctions may be usefully applied in the course of a case to determine whether progress is being achieved. Moreover, intellectual understanding of the transference-countertransference continua prepares the analyst to recognize and deal appropriately with those significant changes in his affective reactions that usually accompany fluctuations in the patient's transference state. Theoretical approach: the perspective of modern psychoanalysis. In the present chapter, these transference-countertransference vicissitudes are viewed in the perspective of modern psychoanalysis. The term is applied here to a specific operational theory that was initially formulated for the treatment of schizophrenic patients. Modern psychoanalysis adheres to the Freudian framework in recognizing and investigating transference and resistance phenomena, but differs from classical psychoanalysis in sanctioning an extensive range of interventions, including symbolic, emotional, and ego-reinforcing communications, rather than relying entirely on interpretive procedures. The basic model technique is amplified to reflect the technical implications of oscillating transference states. Recent findings on the role of aggressive forces in the early evolution of a mind figure in the operational theory, and these forces are dealt with first. Contractual arrangements reflect the degree of purposeful participation the patient is capable of at the emotional level at which he enters treatment. The analyst accepts responsibility for results until the patient has progressed sufficiently to share it, and works systematically to transform the relationship into a full-fledged working alliance. Although it was formulated primarily for patients who do not respond sufficiently to the classical approach, modern psychoanalysis appears to be developing into a broad psychotherapeutic science applicable in all psychologically reversible conditions. In modern psychoanalysis, countertransference is defined as the therapist's unconscious reactions to the patient's transference attitudes and behavior. Excluded from this conceptualization are transferences that the therapist may develop to the patient as a neutral object before the patient attaches feelings to the therapist. Two groups of countertransference reactions are identified. 1. Subjective countertransference, that is, atypical feeling responses which are attributable to insufficiently analyzed adjustment patterns in the therapist and are usually rooted in distortions created by memory processes. And 2. Objective countertransference, the feelings that are realistically induced by the patient's transference feelings and attitudes. The terms countertransference and countertransference resistance are used as reciprocals of transference and transference resistance. The working concept itself is thus purged of any value judgment. Subjective countertransference is the source of most countertransference resistance, but it is recognized that the objective countertransference may also give rise to anti-therapeutic interventions. The importance of analyzing out the subjective countertransference is emphasized. On the other hand, while the resistance potential of the objective countertransference is recognized, the student analyst is trained to sustain it and use it as a source of therapeutic leverage as well as for understanding the patient. It is recommended that the induced feelings be experienced freely and fully in order to help the therapist maximize his empathic understanding of the patient. The induced feelings are communicated selectively, according to the specific therapeutic requirements of the situation. These feeling responses are utilized, in principle, for the specific purpose of resolving an immediate resistance of the patient. Therapeutic leverage resides in their impact on the patient. This, as the trainee learns, is directly proportional to their genuineness. The focus in this chapter is on the phenomenology and technical implications of the therapist's effective reactions to a patient functioning in a state of narcissistic transference. To distinguish these feeling responses from those evoked by the patient in a state of object Oedipal type, transference, they are classified as narcissistic countertransference. Of historical interest is the early use of this term in a strictly pejorative sense by Ferenczi and Rank, 1925. They state, "Narcissism of the analyst seems suited to create a particularly fruitful source of mistakes. The development of a kind of narcissistic countertransference, which provokes the person being analyzed into making flattering remarks about the analyst and suppressing unpleasant remarks about him." p. 41. Obviously, this statement refers to the analyst's transference to the patient as a neutral object or to his subjective reactions to the patient's transference attitudes, that is, narcissistic countertransference of the subjective type. But I am exclusively concerned here with the analyst's realistic affective reactions to a patient in a state of narcissistic transference, the objective type of narcissistic countertransference. Without conceptualizing it as such, many authors have implicitly referred to it or highlighted its characteristics. The reciprocal interchange. The primitive attitudes manifested by a patient in a state of narcissistic transference suggest a symbolic revival of clusters of experience during the pre-Oedipal period. These attitudes may also be viewed as the patient's unconscious attempts to reveal basic maturational needs that were not met by the primary object during the undifferentiated period. Kernberg, 1976, refers to the activation of units of early self and object images and the primitive affects linking them, page 400. A severely disturbed patient may appear to be totally unaware of the therapist's presence and totally preoccupied with himself. The therapist may then tend to focus on himself and become totally unaware of the patient. The patient may experience the therapist as part of the self or like the self. The therapist may feel that he is in the presence of a kindred spirit or experience a strange sense of harmony. Meadow, working with a young woman in a pre-ego state, found herself experiencing the same feelings of objectlessness. The patient may attribute his own feelings to the therapist or the therapist's feelings to himself. When, for example, the patient feels tired, he may think that the therapist is tired. In that situation, the therapist may become aware of feelings of fatigue in himself. At times when the therapist is in a cheerful frame of mind, he may have the impression that the patient is in a similar state of mind. When a very depressed patient talks repetitively about committing suicide, I suddenly experience strong anger. I become aware of urges to get out of the office for the day or get rid of the case. Schizophrenic patients early in treatment characteristically verbalize feelings of emptiness, strangeness, confusion, and hopelessness. The therapist may then be assailed by feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. At the height of the narcissistic countertransference, objective, he tends to oscillate between states of self-preoccupation and anxiety. The patient's delusions and other psychotic productions may alarm the therapist, and he may become aware of desires to tranquilize the patient. The therapist tends to feel more and more removed from the patient. Many years ago, for example, I treated a psychotic woman who told me, "I talk to you 1 hour a week in this office and the rest of the week in my mind." I tried to understand the gibberish she talked during the first year of the relationship and made a great effort to talk to her, but I felt totally withdrawn. I attributed this emotional withdrawal to some problem in myself, but subsequent analysis helped me recognize that the patient was inducing that state in me. By and large, the analyst uses many conscious and unconscious mechanisms not to experience and not to be controlled by the realistically induced feelings. Until the patient's problem is fully understood, however, the truly objective countertransference, Winnicott, 1947, may give rise to countertransference resistance. Hidden countertransference resistance, originating in the objective type of narcissistic countertransference, is delineated below in clinical material drawn from 2 cases. In the first, the prompt recognition and resolution of such resistance facilitated the treatment of a borderline patient. The second case illustrates how narcissistic countertransference resistance led to temporary regressions in a schizophrenic patient.